Before I turn it over to Donovan in a second, I just want to do a few quick thank yous. We're going to have to do thank yous throughout the conference. Don't worry, it's not all going to happen at once because there's a lot of people to thank. But first of all, we've had some beautiful musicians from the Bard Conservatory here, and I just want to thank them for bringing some joy into our lives. And I was just talking to Bill, we talk a lot up here. That's what we do. And yet there's a visceral and other elements to joy that are important as well. And I hope you have moments where you sit and stop and listen to the music and watch and experience and feel the joy of the beautiful day. Again, I'm going to thank people over the next day or two, but I do want to thank the core team at the Hannah Arendt Center that has made this happen. Tina Stanton, who's our executive director who runs this conference every year, and I want to thank Tina for making it work. So thank you very much. Hillary Harvey is our communications manager. She does all our Instagram and social media, but much more than that. And I want to thank Hillary. Someone was telling me, I came here because of Instagram. That's great. Thank you, Hillary, for doing that. Jana Mater is our director of academic programs. She's run all the breakout sessions, and she does an enormous job with the student fellows and everyone else. Thank you, Jana. You all see Phil Lindsay doing the work here on stage. But that's his second job. He runs the Democracy Innovation Hub, our work on citizen assemblies, and that's going extremely well, so thanks, Phil. And then we have a bunch of recently graduated student fellows, Monica Byrne and Alex Vietenoff and Maggie Ho. Thank you all to them and to our student fellows who you see around with those beautiful bright orange sweatshirts. Well, I guess as I said, I'm going to thank many more. And Susan Oberman, by the way, who's been running the breakout sessions online, is doing a great job. She runs our dialogue groups as well. So I wanted to thank Susan. I'm going to turn it over to Donovan and enjoy this wonderful afternoon we have planned for you.
I'm going to actually start with some thank yous as well, just because, so I'm Donovan Hohn, mainly an essayist, but I suddenly find myself acting editor of Lapham's Quarterly, and although it's not officially designated as such in your program, this is kind of the Lapham's Quarterly panel this afternoon. What's that? There you go. All right, so there you go. So my thank you, I want to start is, if you don't know this, that Bard College is now the new steward for Lapham's Quarterly. I'm immensely grateful to Roger Berkowitz and the Hannah Arendt Center for making that possible. I'm grateful as well to Leon Botstein. When I'm not editing for Lapham's Quarterly, I teach at Wayne State University in Detroit, which is the CUNY of Detroit. Yes. Where Charles Baxter, novelist, essayist, whom you're going to hear from today, began his own teaching career. And I just want to say thank you to Leon Botstein as well, who's been very vocal in his defense of higher education, and at a place like my institution, a publicly funded urban research university, it's definitely felt imperiled. So having the full-throated support of institutions like Bard means a great deal. We're going to be talking a bunch today about Moby-Duck. It's going to be about joy and loving the world in dark times, but I'm going to try to set the table a bit for what you're going to hear. At Lapham's Quarterly, we've been doing, I learned how to host a podcast, and on the Lapham's Quarterly podcast, I've had a series of conversations with writers and historians about Moby-Duck. You're going to find out why in a moment. But the idea is I invite a writer or historian on, they pick a chapter of the novel, and we spend like an hour talking about it. Francine Prose did the chapter 1 of Moby-Duck with me this last August, and Charles Baxter came on and talked with me about chapter 9, the sermon. So if you don't know your Moby-Dick, just know in chapter 9, Ishmael, having recently arrived in the town of New Bedford, looking for a ship, having just met a mysterious harpooner named Queequeg, goes to church and hears one of the most memorable sermons in all of American letters, delivered by a preacher named Father Mapple. You're going to hear a bit about that this evening. But I have some remarks, Charlie has some remarks, and then the three of us are just going to have a conversation. All right? My remarks are called Ishmael's Handkerchief, because we published on the website of Lapham's Quarterly an essay by Charlie Baxter under the title, The Flag of Ahab, on the literature and politics of charisma. Somewhat confusingly, you're going to hear my remarks are actually a response to Charlie's essay, but it's all going to work, trust me. All right. 14 years ago, in 2011, I think in this room, I think on this stage, Louis H. Lapham delivered the keynote here at the annual conference of the Hannah Arendt Center. The theme that year was truth-telling, democracy in an age without facts. Louis spoke with his usual eloquence and charm about the freedom of the press, the freedom of speech, and the freedom of mind. Freedom of mind he considered to be the most precious freedom of all and the hardest to take away. In his memory, I'd like to begin where he ended 14 years ago, because the conclusion to his keynote seems to me germane to this year's subject of joy. I'm going to be quoting Lewis here, who is in turn quoting T.H. White, who is in turn quoting Merlin, the wizard. This is Lewis. I want to end, I'm actually not going to do an impersonation of Lewis. I wish I could. He has this deep, gravelly baritone. I want to end just because I like the quote so much, Lewis said, with something from T.H. White's novel, The Once and Future King. This is Merlin, who is the wizard, talking to the young King Arthur. The best thing for being sad, replied Merlin, is to learn something. That is the only thing that never fails. You may grow old and trembling in your anatomies. You may lie awake at night listening to the disorder of your veins. You may miss your only love. You may see the world about you devastated by evil lunatics, or know your honor trampled in the sewers of baser minds. There is only one thing for it then, to learn. Learn why the world wags and what wags it. That is the only thing which the mind can never exhaust, never alienate, never be tortured by, never fear or distrust, and never dream of regretting. And here Lewis paused a moment before adding, which is the hopeful note on which I will come mercifully to an end. I love that mercifully. If you listen to the audio, you can hear that when he says mercifully, Lewis cracks himself up and the audience laughs with him. The last time I saw Louis H. Lapham in person was at a farewell dinner in December of 2023. He was leaving that same week for a retirement community in Florida, a destination he did not relish after his many years in New York City. And the events that had preceded his departure made his farewell dinner a somewhat gloomy affair. That year, Lapham's Quarterly had steered into a perilous strait, caught between the Scylla of pandemic-related financial distress and the Charybdis of its founding editor's declining health. The dinner was held at a long table in the back of Paul and Jimmy's Ristorante on East 16th Street, where Lewis had conducted much editorial business over the years. His back by that evening had bent into a question mark. He walked with a cane. His voice had gone pianissimo, It was hard to hear him over the restaurant's chatter and din. But he was in his element, captain of a banquet table, leader of a band, taking in the conversations around him. He shared with the assembled crew of current and former editors, his students, that he'd begun rereading Moby-Duck. Someone needed to make a toast, and I was asked to do the honors. As servers were clearing our plates, I chimed my fork against a wine glass. After some personal expressions of gratitude to Lewis, I shared with him two favorite passages from Melville's novel. The first was a long paragraph from chapter 49, The Hyena. So long, I had to look it up on my phone. I'll give you the abridged version here, though the unabridged version is better. There are certain queer times and occasions in this strange mixed affair we call life when a man takes this whole universe for a vast practical joke, though the wit thereof he but dimly discerns, and more than suspects that the joke is at nobody's expense but his own. However, nothing dispirits, and nothing seems worthwhile disputing. There is nothing like the perils of whaling to breed this free and easy sort of genial desperado philosophy. The second quote I shared that evening was short enough that I could recite it by heart. There is a wisdom that is woe, but there is a woe that is madness. I considered titling these remarks, The Flag of Ishmael, in homage to Charlie's essay, The Flag of Ahab. But then it occurred to me that Ishmael has no flag. What he has, at least while wearing the guise of a late consumptive usher to a grammar school, is a queer handkerchief mockingly embellished with all the gay flags of all the known nations of the world, which he uses to dust his old grammars, a task that reminds him of his own mortality. Recently, rereading what is perhaps my favorite chapter of Moby-Duck, chapter 87, The Grand Armada, I stumbled upon this passage. While ponderous planets of unwaning woe revolve round me, deep down and deep inland there I still bathe me in eternal mildness of joy. Note the geography. Woe is planetary, extraterrestrial. Joy is a deep inland lake. Woe and joy are, I think, the opposing, yet admixed and inseparable ingredients of Ishmael's desperado philosophy. I think that in Ishmael's philosophy, and maybe perhaps my own, woe is as inseparable from joy as silence is from music. Speaking of silence, in his conversation with me on the Lapham's Quarterly podcast, Charlie described Father Mapple in his sermon as always on the edge of silence. Charlie's phrase, the edge of silence, keeps surfacing in my thoughts. I keep turning it over, picturing silence as something with an edge, a razor, a table, the sea. This is something that Charlie in his fiction and in his essays is good at doing, giving us images and moments and words that stay with us, inviting contemplation. In fact, for me, the phrase, the edge of silence, brings to mind pianissimo moments in Charlie's own work. Charlie is a virtuoso of listening. What Charlie hears and admires in the closing sentences of the sermon is, I think, a surrender to silence. Having been at the edge of silence ever since he ascended to his pulpit, Father Mapple steps over it. Through language, somewhat paradoxically, Melville creates silence, or a silence. There are different kinds of silence. Fearful silences, contemplative silences, angry silences, imperious silences, dumbstruck silences. There is the horrible silence that separates a child's fall and a child's cry. There is the silence of the grave and the silence of forgetting, which are not the same. The silence Melville creates is not merely the absence of sound. It is a silence of the sort that attends the last note in a piece of music. Like Charlie, I had a churchy childhood, but what left a greater impression on my consciousness than the sermons was the music. I loved hymn singing. I sang hymns with ridiculous gusto. But even better was a Bach fugue, played on an organ, especially in a church like San Francisco's Grace Cathedral, wherein the pseudo-Gothic architecture makes the last echoing note of a fugue go trembling away into a cavernous silence. I can't use the word trembling without thinking of a different last note in a different piece of American fiction, a short story that concludes with a kind of sermon, delivered not from the pulpit of a New Bedford chapel on a stormy night in 1840, but from the stage of a jazz club in Greenwich Village in the 1950s. This other sermon is wordless, performed on a piano, but the performance feels kindred to Father Mapple's sermon, even in its staging and dynamics. The pianist is Sonny, title character of James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues. Like Mapple ascending into his pulpit, Sonny takes the stage, one conjured by a circle of light, of which the story's narrator, Sonny's older brother, observes. I had the feeling that they, Sonny and his bandmates, were being most careful not to step into that circle of light too suddenly. That if they moved into that circle of light too suddenly, without thinking, they would perish in flame. They enter the light ceremonially, taking up their instruments, hesitantly at first, listening for a voice and then finding it. Sonny emerges from what has been for him a wilderness of silence and woe. What is it that Sonny experiences here when the band leader, Creole, on the upright bass, finally leads him out of his wilderness of silence and shows him that, quote, deep water and drowning are not the same thing? Here's the passage. What's he experiencing? Creole listened, commenting now and then, dry and driving, beautiful and calm and old. Then they all came together again, and Sonny was part of the family again. I could tell this from his face. He seemed to have found right there beneath his fingers a damn brand new piano. It seemed that he couldn't get over it. Then for a while, just being happy with Sonny, they seemed to be agreeing with him that brand new pianos are certainly a gas. There's happiness here for sure. Brand new pianos are certainly a gas. But I don't know that we've quite yet modulated from happiness to joy. I think the modulation arrives 2 paragraphs later, here. Sonny's fingers filled the air with life, his life. But that life contained so many others. And Sonny went all the way back. He really began with the spare, flat statement of the opening phrase of the song. Then he began to make it his. It was very beautiful because it wasn't hurried, and it was no longer a lament. I seemed to hear with what burning he had made it his, with what burning we had yet to make it ours, how we could cease lamenting. Freedom lurked all around us. When the number ends, his brother orders Sonny a drink, a scotch and milk. A waitress delivers it. Sonny takes a sip, sets it atop the piano, nods a silent thank you in the direction of his brother. The band starts in on a second number, and the narrator says of the drink, "It glowed and shook above my brother's head like the very cup of trembling." And this phrase, "the very cup of trembling," terminates the story, echoing off into silence. what is the cup of trembling? I asked myself that question the first time I taught the story, and I knew where to look for the answer, the King James Version of the Bible. And sure enough, the phrase appears there twice, in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 2, and Isaiah chapter 51, verse 22. I think James Baldwin must have been thinking of the latter. Thus saith thy Lord, the Lord, and thy God that pleadeth the cause of his people. Behold, I have taken out of thine hand the cup of trembling, even the dregs of the cup of my fury. Thou shalt no more drink it again. The Hebrew word that the translators render as trembling is taralah, which can also be translated as astonishment. And the parallel structure of the verse equates cup of trembling with cup of my fury. For Baldwin, that jazz club in Greenwich Village is no den of iniquity. It's church. And this is perhaps what music is for, and perhaps what joy is for, or at least can be for. To fill the air with life, to make us cease lamenting, to show us that freedom lurks all around us, which is the merciful note on which I will come, hopefully, to an end.
First of all, let me say how honored I am to be here and to be speaking with Donovan and Francine this afternoon. And as we think about terror and joy in a gathering place named for Hannah Arendt, I want to start today by pointing to some features of charisma, one of those odd categories that almost everybody can acknowledge, but no one can define with any precision. Charisma involves casting a spell and being spellbound, and it's hard to theorize about how that may happen. Furthermore, charisma exists in a neighborhood close to religion and religious feelings, making it even harder to pin down. But given the era that we're in now, it may be more timely than ever to think about charisma, if only to untangle ourselves from its effects, particularly in the way it shows up in our current national scene, because, among other reasons, charisma inspires irrational excitement, and to a greater or lesser extent, fear. And here, I have to begin an anecdote that I have debated whether I would include, but finally I think this anecdote accounts for my thinking about charisma. 25 years ago, I had written a novel which was published in translation in Germany. And I went to Germany and toured around. And one of my escorts was a very nice guy named Friedrich. And we got along fine. And he said to me after a week or so, I've told my mother about you, and she wants to meet you. You should come over on Sunday for coffee. And so I did. I met Friedrich's mother, who is a very old woman. And we got to talking about one thing or another, and I did not bring up the subject. I did not bring up the subject of the Nazi era. It came up. I think they, both Friedrich and his mother, wanted me to know that they were free to talk about it. And Friedrich's mother admitted that she had seen Hitler in a motorcade in Hamburg. I don't remember what year. And like the Midwesterner, like the American I am, I said, what was that like? And she said, there was joy. And I said, joy? I wasn't sure that my bad German and her English were, yes, she said, joy, but it was the wrong kind of joy. And I turned to Friedrich and asked him, did I hear this right? And he said, yes, it was the wrong kind of joy. And so I asked Friedrich's mother, what do you mean? And she said, he was a mesmerist. He was a mesmerist. And in some sense, that is at the heart of what I want to talk about today. The word charisma has morphed from the early Christian era when, in the Pauline epistles, it referred to a variety of grace that had everything to do with the divine presence. It was thought to be conferred by the Holy Spirit through the gift of Christ's divinity, and all good things flowed from it. Those who received it were blessed. Charismatic Christianity still holds on to this definition in which the charismatic figure gives off a kind of light and is, in some sense, God-like. Preparing for this talk and knowing that I would be in this auditorium, I examined the books by Hannah Arendt that I happen to own, and in none of them could I find the word charisma listed in the index. As a philosopher, I'm simplifying here, of course, she studied systems webs of Hegelian and Kantian dialectical thought, and she would, I think, have distrusted any propositions that depended on charisma as a force for action, political or otherwise. Charisma is not systematic, and it doesn't lend itself to systems. It's closer to theatricality and to cults. Indeed, in one of her interviews, Hannah Arendt was at pains to deny that Adolf Eichmann possessed anything like charisma, what she herself called a demonic aura. No, for a consideration of charisma as a force in human relations, we would have to go to theorists like Max Weber, Philip Rieff, and René Girard, who was briefly my teacher at Buffalo, in books like Girard's Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. For this subject, you need metaphysicians of the irrational. Girard was fascinated by Dostoevsky's The Possessed and its charismatic figure, Stavrogin. As a contemporary author, Elif Batuman, a one-time student of Girard, has described in her book, The Possessed. What really obsessed Girard was obsession and its relation to charisma. Not surprisingly, Elif Batuman was obsessed by Girard. The charismatic figure is often in the grip of a singular obsession, and his or her or their followers are typically enlisted into the cause. And so today I want to approach this tricky subject by means of what may be the most obsessive American novel, Moby-Duck, and two of its characters, Captain Ahab, whom everyone remembers, and Father Mapple, whom not everybody remembers at all. It's probably a fool's errand to say anything substantial about Moby-Duck in 10 minutes, but for the sake of clarity, today I will be that fool. This is like the Monty Python summarize Proust in 15 seconds. Anyone who has read or tried to read Herman Melville's masterpiece knows that Captain Ahab has set himself and the crew of the Pequod on a crazed and obsessive mission to kill Ahab's nemesis, the white whale. For my purposes, the novel's white whale is a kind of MacGuffin, an unreadable, blank slate object out of myth and nature onto which Ahab's feelings for revenge and his rage are projected, or we might say invested. The whale is, to use the terminology of the critic and philosopher Mary Capello, quote, a legitimizing fetish, something that needn't be translated into rational terms. What interests me about the novel is not the white whale, which is a gigantic animal and a carrier of overdetermined meanings projected onto it in a process that derails the making of meaning in ordinary life. What's more interesting to me is Ahab's relationship to his crew, and the white whale simply serving as a unifying common enemy, which might have been my first point. It helps to have a common enemy to generate a charismatic spell. In the dark version of charisma surrounding Captain Ahab, we may notice certain characteristics which I'll hastily summarize through 4 bullet points. Charismatic figures often stage manage their first appearance from above. Ahab speaks from above his crew, and they can hear his sleepless nightly tread above them. On the ship, no one is his equal. He is above them, they are below him. You have to look up at him in the way that, as a child, you have to look up at your parents. 2, the charismatic figure speaks or lectures to a captive audience, which generally becomes enthralled to him by means of a kind of secular hypnosis. This is not in the nature of a conversation. As a consequence, charismatic figures tend to speechify or to lapse into monologues. They have no friends. They rarely ask questions. Friendship requires conversation, and dark charismatics do not converse. 3, Ahab's pursuit of the white whale is monomaniacal, but everyone else on the Pequod must be enlisted into that cause. And as it turns out, almost everybody will be killed in its pursuit. When the charismatic figure is around, this kind of charismatic figure, violence is in the air. The obsessive common cause creates a mood of communal violence, the unleashing of a collective unconscious in which, and I'm quoting, Mary Capello again, Thanatos, the drive toward death, comes to gain ascendancy over eros, close quote. The result is a loss of proportionality. Nothing else is as important as the charismatic leader's obsessions. Ordinary day-to-day life loses its meaning in this context. Finally, dark charismatics are not particularly interested in individual lives, and they despise compassion and regard it as a weakness. They wish to amass followers who will turn a private obsession into a mass movement. Here in America, we tend to think that charisma begins with the mass hypnosis created by beauty, a beautiful person whose physical image and sex appeal are reproduced in constant screens and photographs. As a culture, we are in the business of the mass production of imagery. We often find such beauty transfixing. But there is such a thing as the charisma of ugliness, what the French call the belle laide, the beautifully ugly. That's what Ahab has, a face you can't turn away from and whose eyes fix you in a stare. As the novel reports, moody, stricken Ahab stood before them with a crucifixion on his face, in all the nameless, regal, overbearing dignity of some mighty woe. Notice the word crucifixion here. But Ahab is not taking on the sins of others. Instead, he is donating his suffering, what I would like to call his ignorance, to every member of the crew. He is both a captain and the leader of a shipboard cult. When you put these elements together, you find that the dark charismatic figure has a vindictive agenda that he or she wants everyone in the captive audience to share. There is no absence of meaning. Meaning itself has become overcharged and bloated, as in, for example, QAnon's everything has meaning. But when everything has meaning, all sense of proportion is lost, and cruelty, oppression, suspicion, and the urge toward death may be the result. When we last see Ahab, who is a virtuoso of hatred, he is outside the whale, stabbing at it with his harpoon and shouting, "From hell's heart I stab at thee, for hate's sake I spit my last breath at thee." And there he goes, under the water, taking hell and hatred, and let's not forget terror with him, along with his crew, except for Ishmael, our narrator, the sole survivor. The ship, the novel tells us, goes down like Satan to hell, quote, dragging a living part of heaven with her. It's no wonder that one critic, Andrew Delbanco, in Melville, His World and His Work, makes a connection between charisma and fascist destruction. Quote, in Captain Ahab, he writes, Melville had invented a suicidal charismatic who denounces as a blasphemer anyone who would deflect him from his purpose, an invention that shows no sign of becoming obsolete anytime soon. But there is a contrast to Ahab in Moby-Duck, and that is Father Mapple, who appears in chapters 8 and 9 and who has a charisma of his own. We are here to talk about joy, thanks to him. Father Mapple gives a sermon in chapter 9 that serves as a warning against collective will toward death, a sermon whose end result is the repeated word delight. To start with, Father Mapple has a, quote, mild voice of unassuming authority. Like Ahab, he speaks to a captive audience located below him, but his voice is mild. And in his sermon on Jonah, who is not outside the whale trying to kill it, but who is inside the whale, learning humility and proportion, it turns out that it is all about proportion and modesty and humility. At no time does Father Mapple say that he is better than his congregants, and instead claims that he is one of them. Quote, I am a greater sinner than ye, and now how gladly would I come down and sit on the hatches there where you sit and listen as you listen. And then in the last words of Father Mapple's sermon, we come upon one of the few instances in American literature of a praise of humility and not of the imperial self. Quote, and eternal delight and deliciousness will be his, who coming to lay him down can say with his final breath, O Father, mortal or immortal, here I die. I have striven to be thine more than to be the world's or mine own. Yet this is nothing. I leave eternity to thee. For what is man that he should outlive the lifetime of his God? I always get choked up when I read that. Father Mapple's sermon asserts there's more joy in modesty and humility than there is in egomania and vindictiveness. The thirst for revenge is not a joyful enterprise, but one in which the ego is in charge. This is all common sense, you might think. And when we last see him, he is slowly waving a benediction at his congregation. I want to finish these brief remarks by arguing that the passion for revenge puts the ego in charge. And when the narcissistic ego is in charge, there's no satisfying it. The ego's hunger can never be satisfied until the ship goes down waving the flag of Ahab. It seems almost counterintuitive to say that joy may arrive suddenly when we put out our egos, what our culture tells us we should cultivate. When we put all that aside and we start to be more interested in other people than we are in ourselves, when we begin to ask questions and are interested in the answers. And like Father Mapple, we might try to help other people and to speak the truth as he advises and behave as if we are as interested in what we can do for others as we can for ourselves. And because I began with an anecdote, I want to end with a poem. There was a reference to a Wordsworth poem this morning, Intimations of Mortality. One of the last poems that Wordsworth wrote that was any good is a sonnet, usually titled Surprised by Joy. And the background to this sonnet is from 1812. It was published in 1815. And it's about the grief that Wordsworth felt long after the death of his daughter, Catherine. And the poem is about the moment when he's standing on a hill and the grief has lifted. And it's the movement from grief to the moment when the grief no longer weighs him down that the poem is about. Surprised by joy, impatient as the wind, I turned to share the transport. Oh, with whom but thee? Deep buried in the silent tomb, that spot which no vicissitude can find. Love, faithful love, recalled thee to my mind. But how could I forget thee? Through what power, even for the least division of an hour, have I been so beguiled as to be blind to my most grievous loss? That thought's return was the worst pang that sorrow ever bore, save one only, when I stood forlorn, knowing my heart's best treasure was no more, that neither present time nor years unborn could to my sight that heavenly face restore. And the one other poem that I've thought of in this context, where grief leads to something like joy, is a poem by Langston Hughes. I think it's only 6 lines. Wave of sorrow, do not drown me now. I see the island still ahead somehow. I see the island and its sands are fair. Wave of sorrow, take me there.
Does this work? Can you hear me? Oh, thank you, Donovan. Thank you, Charlie. Those were marvelous. I have a probably unanswerable question for both of you. In your essay, Charlie, you make this distinction, a really interesting distinction between dark charisma and light charisma. And clearly, Ahab is dark charisma, and Father Mapple is light charisma. And when I was reading the essay, I was thinking how much easier it is to think of examples of dark charisma than light charisma. I mean, all you have to do is turn on your phone and just your dark charisma is scrolling all the way down. And then I thought light charisma, Gandhi, maybe Martin Luther King. And you began by saying everyone knows who Ahab is, and nobody knows, or almost nobody. So why did the dark charismatics leave so much more of a mark, and why are they so common? And finally, this is the unanswerable part, as if that wasn't. What chance did the light charismatics have against the dark charismatics?
You may know that phrase. I think it's Henri de Montaigne saying, which says that happiness writes white, in the sense that there are fewer stories about happiness and fewer stories about joy, fewer stories about generosity, fewer stories about caring for others than there are stories about somebody who has led a number of people, family, whoever it might be, to destruction. Literature has a way of liking conflict and being interested in destruction. I used to give my students a kind of challenge. This was in creative writing classes. I would say, I want you to come back next week with 4 or 5 paragraphs that are just about happiness. And they would come in the following week, often saying, we couldn't do it. We couldn't do it. I don't know how to write about happiness. In the same way that Father Mapple gets 2 chapters. Ahab gets almost all of the others. I don't like to say that as readers, as human beings, we are more interested in the destructive element, but I think to some degree we are. About your second question, what chance does the light charismatic have? I like to think if we are to be active people in the world, we have to believe that the good will eventually prevail. But we may have to fight for it.
Yeah, Ahab gets more chapters than Father Mapple, but Ishmael gets the whole novel. Okay, and there is this notion. I wanted to add to the opposition you suggested, Charlie, between Mapple and Ahab. I'm interested where Ishmael is in this, because I don't think Ishmael's charismatic except on the page, and that's different. It's not the kind of theatrical public charisma we're talking about. And it's a dark novel. It's an apocalyptic novel. But Ishmael lives to tell the tale. And the telling of the tale, I think, is the triumph. And what saves him, spoiler alert, is Queequeg's coffin, both Father Mapple and Ahab are solitary up in their pulpits. Ishmael is not. Francine, you may recall when we talked about loomings, we noticed the paragraph in which Ishmael observes that everyone receives the universal thump, and so we'd best just rub one another's shoulders. He talks about the milk of human kindness. So I feel that there is a possibility suggested in the novel that in the end, Ahab goes down, Ishmael is in a life raft from his best friend / possibly lover, Queequeg's coffin.
It's, I think, also important to remember that God or the fates have intervened because that coffin exists in the first place, because Queequeg has foreseen his death because of casting. What is it that he casts?
The bones.
It's the bones.
Right?
He casts the bones. And there's a sense in Moby-Duck that we are watching the working out of a kind of cosmic drama, that the god or the gods have intervened in this story. and are forcing events in the way that they have. Even Ahab thinks that. Ahab starts to refer to himself in the third person about halfway through the novel, as if he's watching himself as a player in a story that he himself isn't writing, that this play was written by someone else.
Oh, yeah. Before we move on from, could I say just a word in defense of the not MacGuffin-ness of the white whale? I mean, sure. Because we're doing this week, we're doing Bartleby in my class. And reading it, and I was thinking about Moby-Duck, and I was thinking about other Melville works, and I was thinking one of the things that he was most interested in was mysteriousness, was things that can't be explained, which is, has a kind of spirituality and has a kind of, and is certainly there in Father Mapple's sermon and certainly there in the end. And part of when people ask why it's all that scientific information about chapters and chapters of cytology, and when the last time I read it, I thought, oh, well, Melville is saying, like, here's everything you can possibly know scientifically about whales. And then there's this mystery, which is Moby-Dick, which no matter what you do or what you learn or what you know can't be explained. In the same way that you can't figure out why Bartleby is preferring not to do anything. So I think, so I want to talk, because we're all writers and we kind of, besides being charismatic, we all have that in common. I want to talk, since this is the Joy Conference, I do want to talk about joy in writing. Because I think it's something that isn't talked about enough, because writing's so hard. But I don't know, Charlie, Donovan, you have any thoughts about this?
You want me to go? Joy in writing. The easy, glib answer is, who is it that said that it's no one likes writing, you like having written? Right. There may be some truth to that. Wrong. Yeah. I think for me that there's a reason we do it. That for me, it's helpful to analogize to music. What's music for? Right. So much of the process is arduous. For me, it's painstaking and slow, but I'm going to quote one of my students, brilliant young poet from Detroit, who, when I asked the question, why do we write poetry? I do it because I have to. It's how I make sense of my life. And on some basic level, I feel like that's an answer. Now, is there joy in it? Sometimes. Right? Sometimes. Sometimes there's joy in the act of it. Sometimes there's joy in the sharing of it, as came up with our discussion with poets.
There's a certain kind of joy, I think, that arises from recognition. And in writing, often... it's wonderful.
I'm sorry, Charlie.
That happened on the podcast episode, Francine.
Yeah.
Someone who doesn't know how to turn off her phone.
Where was I? We were talking. The part of the joy of writing for me has to do with two things. One is a kind of recognition of certain kinds of stories that matter to me. And because they matter to me, and because they're, and to go back to the question of obsession, because I am obsessed by them, I hope in some way that readers will be obsessed in a good way by the recognition of something they knew, but they didn't know that they knew. And there's also the great joy, just purely the way a musician takes pleasure in a musical phrase. Writers and readers can take pleasure and joy from a perfect sentence. The art of writing is indeed a joy. But we have to say, and I mentioned this in the interview that I did with Donovan that writing was not always a joy for Melville. And the novel that he wrote after Moby-Dick is called Pierre, or The Ambiguities. And there's a oh, that's wonderful.
I'm so it's like a nightmare. Go ahead.
There's a chapter in Pierre called Pierre at his book. And it's about the agony of writing. And in it, Pierre, who is working on a novel and is a sort of surrogate of sorts for Melville, is having such pains writing that, as Melville says, he would fain cut off his head to put an end to the thoughts that are there. There's no joy, there's no pleasure without pain.
Yeah, some days are better and worse than others, right? Yeah. No, I agree completely with the sentence. I mean, the sentence in the word. I mean, just finding the right word when you couldn't think of it before, and then suddenly there it is. I mean, you know, people in my family who've been around when have heard me like talking to myself, and it's usually at that moment when I go, you know, yeah.
Yes, on the most recent episode of The World in Time from Lapham's Quarterly, I interviewed Elizabeth Colbert, who, I don't know if people read her piece in The New Yorker in 2023, in which she goes out with 21st century cetologists who are trying to decipher the language of sperm whales. And there's part of me that wants to say that I think it's language. It's something that's deeply human to us. I mean, it feels to me it's akin to creatures needing to vocalize all around us. It's so essentially human. Now, we didn't always have writing, so maybe that's a slightly different thing. We know the Odyssey. It descends from oral literatures, as does much of the Hebrew Bible, and maybe what I'm trying to say is not about writing, but about language. But it feels to me profoundly human, and I think that even if the act of writing can be an agony sometimes, it can be a joy, even for Melville. I think he's in writing Moby-Dick. I think there are moments that feel to me where he's kind of in a kind of ecstasy at his writing desk, where he feels transported at his writing desk. I think both can coexist, and I think that for me, what would be the greater agony is compelled silence, and in a way, I want to say that the act of writing is the antithesis of a compelled silence. That's what I love, that in that Baldwin passage I quoted, he says that listening to Sonny's blues, we learn that freedom lurked all around us. Now, as we heard earlier this morning, certainly for James Baldwin in the 1950s, those were dark times. I mean, he even had J. Edgar Hoover's FBI stalking him around. So dark times. And yet, even there, freedom lurked all around us. So the act of writing a poem, a novel, an essay, a talk, feels to me an exercise of freedom. That's why I think of that laughter as itself a kind of freedom. So is it time, Roger, I'm sorry, is it time for questions, or did we, questions? Okay, great. So it looks like, Francine, you're in charge.
Let's just go, the guy, yeah.
Hello, can you hear me? So I wanted to ask a question about the idea that there are more dark charismatics than light charismatics, and I wanted to sort of push back against that a little bit by asking about the negativity bias. So if we say that the negativity bias serves some evolutionary purpose, it exists because remembering that which is negative helped us, emerge from the savannah, then it might be that it's not that there are more dark charismatics, but rather that we have a greater felicity and capacity to remember them and to index them and are sort of drawn to their stories. And it might be that there's a distinction without a difference between those two phenomenon, but it seems like they would suggest different solution sets. If there's a shortage of light charismatics, you would want to cultivate light charisma or find people and train them. If the difficulty is that we can't remember them, then it's sort of a matter of attention and intention that we would need to cultivate sort of in ourselves. And so I just wonder if that's a distinction that's worth exploring, or if there might be something to that intuition, or how that sort of bears on the sort of diagnosis of the problem.
It's a great question, and my own feeling is that the literature of the blessed charismatics, the ones who are giving rather than taking, the charismatics who are engaged in the conversation, that literature, for me, is more often found in sacred texts. And I don't know how to elaborate that thought except to say that I think that the great models of generosity and of love and of blessedness have a tendency to become sacred texts to us. And that too is a kind of memory, of course.
No, I think you're right. I think it's a matter of attention or concentration because when you think about it, I mean, when we think about Anna Karenina, for example, I think we think of Vronsky before we think of Levin. The charismatic villain rather than, but the minute you've been saying it, this sort of a little parade of good light charismatics. I mean, led by Saint Francis of Assisi, for example. I mean, and I think Charlie's right. Religious literature is just full of them, and it's just a question of what we pay attention to and where we look at for it.
Let's go with a student.
People think I'm 20. Hi. First off, thank you for inspiring me to read Moby-Dick. I think I finally have to get around to it now. Second off, so you guys spoke about the dark charismatic, and you referenced particularly Captain Ahab, what happens when he reaches his white whale. Spoilers, by the way, thanks a lot. So I'm curious, if we look at the dark charismatics now, I'm thinking of one in particular, his name, you guys can assume the guy I'm talking about. And so, Donald Trump. So I'm curious, what do you think? I know no one here is a see, if I say the name, a ghost starts wailing. They're all terrified. So I'm curious, what do you think happens? And I know you guys aren't historians or political theorists, but I'm just curious for your opinions on this. What do you think Trump's white whale is? And more importantly, what do you think happens when he reaches it?
You guys?
The golden calf is one of them. But because it is so ego-driven, my belief is that there is no satisfaction. It is just going to be, there is an endless hunger of the ego that will still try to accumulate and find a new enemy, find a different other.
I mean, I think that's as good as any. About this, spoilers, sorry about that, but you really don't read Moby-Dick for the plot. That's my
Yeah, no, I think Charlie's right. I mean, dark charisma kind of feeds on itself. Even, I mean, maybe it's greed, maybe it's envy, maybe it's anger or hate, but essentially it's kind of self-sustaining. But I think one of the things that that we can learn from looking at our moment of dark charisma is why people were drawn to it. I mean, I think that, for example, in the current case, I mean, one of my neighbors is a very ardent Trump supporter and a very nice guy, and I realized that this guy, you know, big macho guy in the country, big macho truck, is frightened. I mean, has like endless numbers of spy cams on his property and double locks doors on the doors. But people like, you know, strong leaders, whether they be Trump or Hitler, make people feel safe, and that's part of. Although I can't imagine Ahab making anyone feel safe for very long.
But he gives them a purpose.
Right.
One last question, maybe from this side of the room, just out of like, you know, geometry. You're a student? All right.
Thank you. So I was also on the topic of dark charisma and kind of related to the Trump supporter stuff. I saw that you compared the like stage thing as this dark charismatic person Ahab is always standing above people, or at least he at first is, to looking up to an adult. And then you also said that people with obsession are like the dark charismatic people that people follow. Or maybe people with purpose almost, and then the people that follow them are people without purpose that, like children looking up to adults, are almost looking for something to do with their lives, answers to things that they don't know. And then when you get to the MAGA movement, maybe do you see a lot of people who, in America especially, who are living lives without purpose, and they'd rather believe, I guess, that they have this purpose to fight off some great evil through voting for Trump and supporting all these hateful policies, than know that they really aren't doing much and that there isn't. Yeah, I guess that's my question.
You're exactly right. I don't have very much to respond to that, except that there's one other feature of joy that I have to mention, and it's because I came here from Minneapolis by Amtrak. I like going on trains. And if you ride Amtrak, you see people greeting each other on platforms, just coming together in the most joyous condition. And it made me think that one of the features of joy is that it signals a moment when something has ended and something new begins. The pregnancy is over, the labor is over, and the baby is here. The war is over, peace has arrived, and strangers are kissing on Times Square. I mean, you can think of these moments of transition from one thing to another, and I think my response to what you're saying is that obsession has a way of perpetrating itself until it finally gutters out. There's something that is not, there are some obsessions that, of course, are life-giving, but the ones we've been talking about this afternoon are, by and large, not so much that. So I would just say, think about the transitions from one condition to another, and the way that sometimes joy can be retrospective. After my son was born, I felt nothing, and then driving home, I burst into tears and had to pull the car over. Joy can come after you think it's going to come, when it finally finds a home in you. So.
Let's end with that.